Stratton, I'm just going to meet you today to office hours right after this class. Is that going to be here?
We can meet here. It's only in my office. But I'm going to go over some of the problems. So, but yeah, stay after this class.
Yeah,
because we should get a little bit early.
I got most of chapter 9. Obviously, it was just like a few things. I was like,
Yeah. Yeah, stay after, and then if we need to clear this room out, we'll go to my office. Thank you. We have a few more. Joe's left?
Yeah.
Riley? Riley? Oh, yeah. Okay. Thank you. Kevin Wynn? There you go. Garrett? Bella? Bella here? Okay, so as you'll notice, as I've said many times, they're not graded. I don't grade them. So it is your responsibility to go back and look at the solutions that are on Moodle to make sure you're doing it right. Now, some of them on the commonly missed problems, I do look at a little more closely. And so some of you might have notes on there that says something like, you know, it should equal this, or, you know, pay more attention to something, or, you know, but for the most part, just because there's no marks on it doesn't mean you got it right. So when you go into Moodle, what you'll see is the practice solutions for 1, 3, and 7. And you also see this this new thing on here, 5th edition. And that's because I've discovered some problems. Let's talk about the problems. So that's the book for the class, Macroeconomics, Krugman-Wells, 5th edition. Now I know some of you have got online a PDF, which looks very similar to this, but it just says economics, right, by Krugman and Wells in 5th edition. That's the wrong book. So if you're really confused and you don't know what's going on and the questions don't match up to what I'm talking about in class, that's because you have the wrong book. This is the PDF version that some of you have. So if you're trying to do the practice problems out of that book, it doesn't add up. I don't have the solutions for that. I don't know if you're doing good or not. Probably not, because it's the wrong topics. So with that said, get the right book. And if you have a different edition besides 4 or 5, does anybody have like the 6th edition or previous to 4? Anybody? You know, which one do you have? You know,
Or at least I use a PDF online version, but I'm not sure what they
and is it a macroeconomics?
Yes, by saying.
Okay, just make sure it's macro, because there is a PDF. The micro version just says economics. Okay. What I'm getting at is, if you don't have 4th or 5th, I don't know if these solutions are right. If you do have 4th or 5th, pick the right one, 4th or 5th. So I guess there's a bigger change between 4 and 5 than I realized. So some of the practice problems are different. So just to be extra safe, if you have the 5th edition, use that to go over your answers, and 4th edition, use that. So for every chapter. Okay, any questions about that? So again, and I'm repeating myself, I just want to make sure everyone understands. The midterm is pulled off questions that look very similar to these. That's why I want you to go back and check your own answers and make sure that you understand the logic. Yeah,
Right, so you're not grading the homework, you're only grading the midterm?
yeah, the homework's not graded at all. The practice problems are not graded at all. I mean, I go through and I read them and I give you credit. If you want me to grade them, I will. But if you look right now in your Moodle, you all have 100 if you turned it in. If I grade it, it'll go down to whatever the score would be. And some of these are really bad. Some of them don't deserve credit, but you know, it's the first couple assignments, so I was extra generous. It's a benefit to you. If you do it, it's mostly on track and it looks like you put some effort in, you get 100, so it boosts your grade up. The midterm I do grade. And it's hard, right? No one gets an A on this midterm and final. You know, it's a hard test. It is a hard class. So I look for every opportunity to boost things like giving you full credit for these practice problems if it looks like you did full effort. Okay, so I covered the book. I covered the practice problems. I feel like there was something else I wanted to cover. I can't remember what it is. Okay. Anybody, so any questions about the book or the practice problems? No? Okay. You guys feeling okay? That's a low energy today. A low energy day. I can see it already in this class. It was last class was really bad. So we'll take it easy today. Who's expecting to do a presentation? Isaac? Anybody else? And Isaac, you uploaded to, okay. Yeah, the PDF thing is kind of funny. You know, I assumed that it was pirated. I'm not going to argue, man. I spent so much money on books in college. I wish it worked out. I wish you guys, if you could find the right one, great. I have no problem against that you guys using the PDF and not the $200 book. But yeah, it's just not going to work if it's not the right actual book. So let's talk about some of these problems though. There's some commonly missed problems. So I wanted to go over them in class. So I think start with okay. I already went over this one, but let's do it again because it's on. This is on the midterm. One just like this is going to be in the midterm, and a lot of you got it wrong on the practice problems. So let's make sure everyone gets it. Let's make sure everyone gets full points for this. So there's 3 ways. This question was determine GDP in this microeconomy here. The 3 different ways. So the first way is what is the price? What's the output price of the total of the final goods and services? So in this microeconomy here, there's only one final good, and that's the pizza company making final pizzas. These are both intermediate goods. So if we're looking at the way to determine GDP only using final goods and services, we ignore this. And we can look and we see, oh, the value of output of the only final product on here is 200. Oh, there we go. 200. GDP is 200. So that's way 1. Looking at the value of the final goods and services. That one's really easy. The other way you can look at it, the second way, is you can look at what value every player is adding to the economy. So how you do that is you look at, for this player here, bread company, what their value to what their output value is and subtract their input. So if it costs them money to buy flour or whatever for the making of the bread, it would be here. And you would take their final output value and subtract their input value. And the difference is what they added value to the economy. In this case, it's 50 because there's no input value. Same with the cheese company, 35 minus zeros, they added 35. Okay, but then with the pizza company, they sold it for their outputs 200, but their inputs were 85. 50 plus 35, the difference of 115. So they added 115 value. So 115 plus 35 plus 200 or plus 50 is 200. So that's the second way. You figure out the value each player added to the economy, add it up. And how do you know you got it right? You know you got it right because the first way you figured it was 200, and then the second way you figured it's 200. That makes sense. Same GDP, we're just getting there different ways. The third way is a bit tricky. People get it wrong in the midterm, and a lot of you got it wrong here. And I don't blame you because it's almost like a trick question. The third way is looking at factor income. So we can look at the final cost of all this was 200 right here. So what did the pizza company take that $200 in cash, and what did they do with it? Well, some of it went to wages for their own employees, and some of it went to wages for the employees of the inputs they bought, right? But that only adds up to 35, so 110. Well, 110 is not 200, so they took in $200, but they only spent 110, right, onto wages. Where did that remaining money go? Well, in this case, it probably went to profit, probably went to the owner's pocket. That's not listed on here, so is it a trick question? No, it's not a trick question. They just left out a piece of information that they figured you could figure out yourself. You could figure out this company took in 200, but only 110 went to wages, so 90 of it went someplace else, owner's pocket for profit. Maybe it went to rent. I mean, you can make up anything you wanted to, but you have to explain where the difference between the wages, you know, where else the money went. If on the midterm, you see a question like this and you said 3 different ways to do GDP and you come up with 3 different GDPs, it's wrong. It has to be the same GDP. Okay, does that make sense? I know, I feel like I'm repeating myself, but I just know that people still get that wrong, and I just really want to emphasize it. I hope everyone gets it right this time. Let's look at one out of chapter 9. I know you guys probably haven't done chapter 9. It's due next Tuesday. But let's look at it because I think this is a good opportunity to kind of understand how you can kind of use your intuition on an economics test and maybe kind of bluff your way into an answer if you don't quite know. So in this, it's asking, it's showing this chart, and let's kind of ignore from here over. Let's just look at Argentina. So it has a row, 1960, 1980, 2000, 2015. It's giving you real GDP in 2010 dollars, 58, 53, 84. Right? And then it has these question marks, and you need to fill this out. And it's saying, what's the percentage of real GDP per capita here, and what's for 1960 dollars, and then 2015 dollars. Well, even if you don't know anything else, hopefully you can start figuring a couple things out. 1960. Now we talked about this when we talked about before in a base year. When you compare years to years, you have to use a base year, a standard to compare to. And if your base year is the same year as the year you want to compare, then they equal each other. So, right, 1960, it's asking for a percentage, should be 100%, because you're comparing 1960 to 1960. So this should be just an easy given, 100%. And then over here, it's asking for 2015. So you have one piece of data, 58, 53, because you have 1960, and then it says 2015. And you're like, well, they're giving me a 2015 number. So this is probably the other piece of data you need. So what do you do with that? Well, it's asking for a percentage. So if you remember, basic math, percentage is division, right? If you did multiplication, that would come up with a really wacky number, a huge number. It doesn't give you a percentage. You have to divide something. So even if you don't know what to divide, you can just start guessing. So if I took this number, so I know this is one of the numbers, I know that's another number. 128 divided by 53. I come up with 200%. So does 200% make sense here? Is this number 5853 200% of what it would be of this number? Well, that doesn't make any sense. Right? I can look at that and say, wait a minute, that doesn't make any sense because dollars were less back then. This should be a smaller number. So if dividing this by this doesn't work, let's flip it around. 5853 divided by 12,128, 48%. Oh, if I put 48%, now that starts making a lot more sense. So 5853 is 48% of what it would be in 2015. Okay. So just taking piecing together what I have here, I could come up with an answer that intuitively makes sense. And then, the same thing down here. This is asking 2015 and then saying on 2015. So just like here, we know, oh, we're comparing this year to this year, that must be 100%. All right, so there's the answer. All right. Just like we said, this year to this year, 100%, this year to this year, 100%. And then even if you don't know anything else, you can just start taking numbers and dividing them by where it says and come up with something that's intuitive. Right. And so a lot of students might see this original problem and freak out because, oh, look at this, it's huge. There's so much data. I would freak out. So you notice how when I broke it down, I said, let's just focus on this because I can look at this and I can say, oh, this is the same thing as this, same thing as this. So I'll ignore this, focus on here, figure this part out. And then once I figure out what to do, I can just duplicate. Right. The biggest thing I see at midterms and finals is students just kind of freaking out and shutting down. Don't do that. Take it piece by piece. And the engineers see a chart like this and like, oh, okay, this makes sense. And then the marketing students like, oh my God, and just shut down. Yeah, go ahead.
Could you go ahead up to 1980?
Yeah, 1980. Okay, so 1980. So we'll have we're going to figure out as base year is going to be 1960, right? 1960. So you did 8408, and you divide it by the 1960 number 5853. All right. So before we look at the answer to see if I'm even teaching it the right way, let's do that math. 8408 divided by 5853. We come to 1.43, which, negative percentage is 143. Yeah, right there, 143. And then the same thing here would be for the 2015 is 8408 divided by the 2015, 12,128, 69%. 69%, right? So remember, anytime you're comparing a year to another year, you have to figure out the base year. The base year is the year you want to compare it to, and that number goes on the bottom. Okay, I'm going to ask you guys in a minute if you guys have any things come up to your mind that you wanted to go over. But before we do, let's look at these chapter 3 problems. Drawing the graph is the key to all economics classes. This one and every other one you do. And it's almost always the same graph. It's almost always this. It's almost always price and quantity. Price and quantity. And then it's almost always a supply and a demand. So if nothing else in this class, if it says draw a graph, you should have a price and a quantity, and you should have a supply and a demand. That's worth half the points right there if you can get that much on paper. Now, the part about this question that makes you actually do something is it gives you a scenario, and then it wants to know what happened. So in this particular case, it's about a substitute. So they substitute, the price of tacos goes up, so what happens to demand of burgers? Well, it says right there in the question, that's not the question, that's the answer. I forget what it says in the question. Okay, yeah, so it says right there in the question, show what shit happens to the demand curve. So we know it's demand curve, right? And it's a substitute. So we learned, and we went over this, a substitute is a shift in the curve. So we pick the whole curve and we shift it over, and then we label it. This is D2. The little arrow is nice, but you don't have to have the arrow. You could just put D1 and D2. D1 being the original state, D2 after whatever event. And then I know that it's shifting to the right. Little arrow makes it easier for me to read. Okay. So if the question here was the hamburger stand lowered its price by 50 cents, what happens to demand? Right? Then we know it's just price affecting demand, nothing external. So we would just say, oh, there's a new, it would just, come down here, this quantity. But this question triggered us to say substitute, so we know that's a whole shift at every price. Those ones are pretty easy. What gets a little tricky is a little more complicated ones, like this one, where there's a shift in quantity, or excuse me, supply and demand. So this one, you have to parse the words a little bit more. So which one is this? This is about lobsters, I think. 3, okay. Lobster prices usually fall during the summer peak lobster harvest season, despite the fact that people like to eat lobster during summer more than any other time of year. So this one's kind of tricky. So so is it supply or demand or both? So the first thing it says is talking about summer peak lobster harvest. What does harvest sound like? The word harvest, yeah.
Is supply.
Yeah, it's supply, you're harvesting. Demand doesn't harvest. You don't go out and harvest your own lobster when you demand, that's the supplier's job. So the words alone, oh, harvest. So I think a supply is going to be affected. So now that I know the supply curve is going to be affected, I look at which way, left or right. So it says price fall during summer peak, right? What causes supply change for prices to fall? Let's see, shift to the right. Then the next part of this question says the fact that more people eat lobster during the summer. More people eat lobster. That sounds like demand. So now we know there's a second shift, and that's the demand curve. And more people are eating it. So that sounds like it's going to the right. The lobster one's tricky. Let's look at a different one. The price of a Christmas tree is lower after Christmas than before, but with fewer trees are sold. So they're kind of throwing you off. I think fewer trees are sold, like they're trying to throw you to supply. But there's nothing about supply. It didn't say, the Christmas tree field burnt down in a wildfire, it did say something that affects the supply. So we ignore supply and we think about the Christmas tree that is lower after Christmas. Well, what's different after Christmas? Well, demand goes down. So it's just a demand shift. Okay, and then the last one here is another kind of tricky one. So this one's tricky in the wording because they kind of flip it around. The price of the round trip ticket to Paris on Air France falls by more than $200 at the end of school vacation in September. This happens despite the generally worsening weather conditions, the cost of operating flights to Paris. And so this one, throughout all the questions, it poses a supply problem first and then demand. And here it flips it and says, demand's affected because school vacation. So what does that mean? More students graduate and take a summer abroad in France. So demand's impacted first. And then it says the weather conditions. Well, what does weather conditions affect? Supply. It's the airlines. So the trick to economics tests questions about graph, make sure you have a graph right. Make sure you have supply and demand. And then clearly label. If I see a D1 and a D2, I'm good. S1, S2, I know what's happening. I have seen where you don't label it. And it's like, oh, well, this is maybe it's this exact thing, but it's not labeled S1 and S2, so I don't know which way you're saying it moved. And I can't give you points for that. Well, I'll give you some if the graph looks okay, but not full. Okay, anybody have anything else they wanted to go over? Anything just popping in their head that they didn't quite get? Anybody want to be brave and say they didn't understand something? No? Yeah.
For the value of outputs that calculated in GDP, I didn't catch this. And it's 200, but what did you do?
Oh, the pizza one?
Yeah.
Yeah. Let me pull that one back up. In fact, hold on, let me pull the solutions up. What was that chapter? What chapter was that? 7? No. Yeah, this is it. It's not really easy to read, but yeah. So the key to understanding the factor wages. This one was tricky because in this question it doesn't look like they gave you all information. So the key to understanding the factors, the wages, is seeing what the money coming into the business. In this case, we see it's $200 coming into the business, and what we care about is where that money went. They go to wages, profit, rents. So we see some of this at the wages. We just add up these wages, come up to 110, but we don't have a column or a row for like profit. So that's what seemed like it was missing. But we know in our head, we realize, oh, the company took in $200. Where did that? And we can only find 110 of wages. So then you just do some algebra, and algebra is that X equals 90. And you can label it profit or whatever. And that's how you come up with it. Does that make sense? Yeah. So the factor wages. So if you want to study that, it's in the book. Page 191 is the little chart. I think that chart's really good because it gives examples of wages, interest payments, rents, profit, but it's just what the cash that the company brought in went. Okay, great. Okay, well, let's get into our presentation or PowerPoint. And guys, I'm our midterms in a couple weeks. I'm here on Tuesdays and Thursdays. I'm coming all day to campus. Reach out to me and I can do Zoom calls if you have questions. If you feel like you're not getting something, that's what I'm here for. Don't hesitate to reach out. Okay, long run economic growth. Okay, so this is what I don't know, Beijing, I don't know where this is. China looked at one point in time recently. Why does it look like this? Well, because of its growth problem. So growth makes GDP growth, economic growth makes everyone richer, makes everyone happier. Good, but there's side effects. In this particular case, China encouraged this growth through production, manufacturing, and manufacturing has outcomes. Pollution, pollution in water, pollution in air. In Beijing, this is literally what it was for like 10 years every day, a fog. And that's just pure pollution. It's because of the geography of China. It's settled here, and it's just more, more than it can handle. Wind currents bring this pollution all over across the globe. So growth has its downside. It was the same thing here. You see the old movies and shows in England, like Mary Poppins, about the Industrial Revolution in England, where it's all foggy and there's coal, everyone's burning coal, and Mary Poppins, the guy was a chimney sweep, right? All that dust and soot was going in the environment from burning all that coal. Same kind of thing was happening in China. It's air pollution. We had it here in the United States and in westernized European countries. They started protecting their environment through regulation. We passed the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, EPA, Endangered Species Act, all these things to protect the environment so that polluters couldn't pollute the environment but reap the profits. It's called an externality. So if I have a factory, I'm making all these goods and I sell it and I make the profit, but then I'm pumping all this smut into the atmosphere, I don't have to pay that cost of all the lung cancer that's causing people in the town or all the the air pollution. I don't pay that cost. That's being externalized to the community. So we started in the westernized country, we started enacting laws to reduce that. So the polluters are responsible for the pollution. It's happening in China now, but for the longest time it didn't, causing massive environmental damage. Okay, so we like to use as a metric GDP by capita. So if you just look at GDP for a country, this doesn't give you an understanding of what it's like for an individual in that country. So if you take GDP, you divide it by the population, you can come up with GDP per capita to get an idea of how that wealth, how wealthy individuals are. Now, you can see here on this graph from 1900 to 2015, GDP per capita for the United States started off high and has constantly risen at a consistent rate. India and China started off much lower, not reliable data for this period. But like China has, during this time, it shifted from command economy to more capitalist, has the slope of that increase is much higher. Yeah.
Does GDP per capita also or uses or takes into consideration of wealth gaps?
Wealth gaps. That's an interesting question, and it can, yeah. You can massage the data, take out that level. It's like in the United States, we have 3,000 billionaires, or whatever it is. I don't know, a lot of billionaires, and you can massage that data. In pure form, no. And part of that is because the wealth of a billionaire or the wealth of the millionaires correlates into the wealth of the economy, because they're not just, it's not like Scrooge McDuck where the money's just sitting under their mattress or in a vault. That's being rotated through the economy, which we'll get more into later in the semester. So China, you can see in India, which one's India? India is actually per capita, the quality of life per capita is less than where we are, the wealth, per capita wealth in the 1900s. So while they're making great progress, for the average citizen, it was be better in 1920 United States than in India now. Same with China. Correlates to about 1940 or so, 1930. So that's the wealth, which equates to quality of life, is much better in the United States now than even in developed countries, and you don't see that unless you look at GDP per capita. So looking back at the US, you can see in 1900, it's a base year, right? 100%. So we look 1900, so this should equal. But then from 1920, using $1,900, GDP per capita grew 36%. So it's 130% of what it was here. By 1940, 171%. By 2015, 804%. So by 2015, it's 800%, the average citizen is 800% wealthier than they were in 1900. And then, backwards here. Although I think this is wrong. I've been trying to look it up because it says 21%. That can't be right. That doesn't make any sense. I think this is a misprint. It's in the book too. And it can't be right. But going backwards, this is your base year. And you can look at going back to 1900 and 2015 dollars, 12% as wealthy. Yeah, it just, do you see how that doesn't make any sense? 12%, 17%, 21%, that's 21%. This should be like 71 or something. I can't believe there's a misprint that bad in the book. Yeah, so what does that mean? So we're wealthier about 8 times, but GDP doesn't equate to wealth. What it means in more technical terms is our economy produces 8 times more per person. So you can't just say the average person is 8 times wealthier. Really, it's 8 times more production per person. But we as shorthand equate more production, more growth with wealth. Okay, let's look at, incomes around the world. So we're wealthy, we know that. Western Europe's wealthy. I think this data is out of, because I don't think Russia is actually considered high income anymore. But yeah, the countries we expect are the high income countries, Central Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, low income, and then the rest of the world is kind of middle income. So how does that relate to GDP? Growth per capita? Well, in general, 1% growth in GDP per capita would equal about a 1% growth in income. So every year that we grew our GDP per capita equated to about the same percentage of income per person or per capita. So you have these countries that have very little growth or negative growth that equates to lack of growth in personal income and personal wealth. And really it's kind of sad statistic, but 1/4 of the world's population lives in countries where the standard of living is lower than it was in the United States in 1900 because of that GDP per capita growth or lack thereof. Okay, so the formula for this chapter that you should know, it's an easy formula, but it's essentially how do we figure out at a rate of growth how long it's going to take for GDP per capita to double? So the average growth rate in the US is about 3%. So if we take 70, which is, a constant, divided by whatever growth rate we're trying to figure out, in this case, 3%, we'll see that our economy doubles on average every, 22 years, 23 years. Right, and it's a compounding thing. So it doubles. So if it starts off at 10 and it doubles every 20 years, then 20 years is it's 20. But then that 20 is going to double in 20 years. So now it's 40. So it's compounded. And what did Einstein say? Compounding interest is the most powerful force in the universe, right? It's a very powerful force. It's the same reason why you guys should be putting money in your 401k when you get your first job, so it can compound over 40 years, as opposed to waiting till you're 50, like a lot of people do. Okay, so how this would come on a test is something like we'll give you a growth rate and we'll say how long is it going to take for that GDP to double, right? You just take 70 divided by 2 or whatever the growth rate is. Okay. Okay, I think we're gonna stop there. On Thursday, we'll go into the factors that affect long-term growth. So let's take a break, and then when we come back, we'll do Isaac's presentation. So let's say 20 after.